also hope to get with any published manuscript. You can bring what you know to the world for next to nothing. We figure we can offer a university quality, high-level university quality equivalent for about $2,000 over 4 years.
Wow.
Yeah, we have a great social media platform. So I don't know, you tell me what you think about this. So we've been wrestling with price, right? Because pricing something is very difficult. And part of the problem with social media platforms is that they're free. And you might say, well, that's not a problem. It's like, it is a problem because things that are free get overrun by parasites instantly. And so you get the trolls, you get the bots, you get the bad corporate actors, you get the scam artists, because there's no barrier to their participation.
Right.
And so we put a $450 cost on our offering per year for the early adopters. That's available now. And we're hoping that the fact that there has to be a bit of a financial sacrifice in the front end will make our social media network high quality and clean, because there's a little bit of skin in the game to participate. So we've taken the best elements of the popular social media networks and amalgamated that. And we're hoping that we can produce a community of people who are responsible and achievement oriented and upward striving and intellectually curious, and bring them together so they can form their own communities as well as participating in the lectures. And so I'm extremely excited about this. The courses, we got lucky too, because we set up a production studio in Miami, and we have state-of-the-art film crew and editors. But just when we started to film, the AI illustration capacity came online, and we filmed everyone against a white background. And so we can fill the whole background with imagery and graphs and comments. Can you run a trailer for, just pick one of the courses at random, because this is actually how the courses look. So the trailers are very tightly edited, but so are the courses. And so let me show you one of them so you get a sense of what we've managed to accomplish.
Lot of fascinating questions. Where do we come from? Where are we going? What is the universe made of? How can we possibly understand the grand landscape of the cosmos? When you look back in space, you look back in time. It's amazing we've been able to do this, to study the properties of the cosmos, time scales of billions of years, size scales billions of times bigger than our own. And now the question is, can we go back to time equals zero? Can we go back to before time equals zero? And what does that even mean? I hope in this course to keep striving and asking these great questions, because without great questions, there can be no great answers. And without great answers, there can be no understanding.
Wow. Brian Keating.
Fun, Joe.
Pretty bad.
Yeah, well, and I was so happy when I saw the trailers, because Michaela and her husband, Jordan Fuller, they've been working very diligently on this for about 3 years, and they basically built it from scratch, And I didn't have any idea how the courses would look, because that's actually a pretty difficult thing to pull off. But I'm very happy with the trailers. They're extremely engaging. Every course has its own style sheet. So each course has there's an overarching style to the platform, but every single course has its own illustration, ethos, and quality. Yeah, well, you can see them.
Now, is this just for personal education, or will you be giving degrees?
We're going to approach that in two ways. So we'll offer certification at different time spans. So, generally it takes you 4 years to get a degree, but you could imagine that it would be useful to have a 1-year certificate, a 2-year certificate, 3-year certificate, 4-year certificate. There's no compelling reason why it has to be 4 years. We'll keep very detailed records of our students' academic progress, and they'll be able to offer them directly to employers. So we want to be able to assure employers that anybody who's gone through the certification process, that's part and parcel of Peterson Academy, has done the work and met the standards, and the standards will be high. Now, simultaneously, we're working on technical accreditation, right? So that we can have this operate as a standard university. Now, there's trade-offs on that, because the accreditation processes themselves are captured by the same forces that have captured the universities. And we're not going to compromise the quality of the offerings by kowtowing to accreditation processes that are producing the same problem that we're trying to address.
Right.
Now, I'm in discussion with a number of different jurisdictions to move accreditation forward. And if that happens, it can also be applied retroactively. So if we can figure out how to do it with an administration or a jurisdiction that's willing to do it, and we don't have to compromise the quality, then we'll go the classic accreditation route. Otherwise, I'm just going to go directly to employers and say, look, we're going to be very, very careful about who we grant certification to. And you'll be able to rely on the certification from Peterson Academy as an indication of intellectual ability and also work ethic. And we'll document that by the record-keeping process that we use as part and parcel of the platform. So I think we can do it. We're going to do it one way or another.
How are you going to be able to assure that these students, because it's all remote, right?
Yeah.
How are you going to be able to assure that they're actually doing the work, that they're not utilizing AI? Like, are you going to have them write things?
I can't tell you how, but we are going to.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, well, look, I've tested tens of thousands of people online. So I set up an online testing service that was used primarily by a company called the Founder Institute. And we tested 50,000 people, 60,000 people over 5 years in about 7 different languages. And we built and developed technology to capture people who are cheating. So they don't know how we're capturing them. And I'm not going to tell you, but we know how to do it. And, you know, and that's obviously a problem, but it isn't an insoluble problem. And I think we've already solved it. So, and then once we move towards more formal and stable accreditation, there are lots of companies have emerged as a consequence of the COVID lockdowns to make sure that remote compliance with testing requirements can be achieved. So there's lots of ways to solve that problem. So
it's very exciting.
It's really exciting. And it's, you know, there's all sorts of weird possibilities that emerge from this too, because the technology now exists. And we've had some of the videos converted already to have the lectures translated into the world's major languages. And the technology that's cutting edge uses the professor's voice and intonation in the second language and matches the mouth movements to the language.
They're going to do that at Spotify.
Yeah, it's seamless, man.
Yeah,
it's seamless.
They're doing it with podcasts. I think they're initially going to do Spanish, German, and French. I believe those are the first 3 languages, but they eventually will scale out.
Yeah. So that's just like, that's
which
just
is incredible.
It is unbelievable.
Have someone teach a lecture in Russian and actually make the mouth movements and everything.
Well, it's extremely exciting, especially in regard to the developing world, because there'll be more people in Nigeria by 2100 than in China, and the median age of African is 19. So there's an immense opportunity in the developing world to capture the market for higher education, and it would be a wonderful thing to be able to bring this to the world. And I just can't see why not. You know, the courses are very efficiently taught. We have AI-mediated testing services, and we can use the tests themselves as educational tools. You know, so you can imagine you have a test, you get a question wrong, and you get feedback that it's wrong, and it'll tell you where in the lecture or the reading material that you made the mistake, so you can go back and review. And so even the testing itself will be education. And, you know, we're hoping to develop a community that is composed of people who want to engage in lifelong learning. And it also means that you don't have to be like 18 to 22 to attend this university. You can stay a part of it for the rest of your life. And we're hoping that spontaneous communities will develop and that we can bring people together for conventions. So, you know, if we can get enough people on the platform, we'll have conventions in different cities where we bring our lecturers, you know, to a stadium or to a theater for a weekend, and everybody who's part of the university can come and listen to their favorite lecturers. And we've got educational institutions who are already interested in partnering in that regard so that they can be brought to their institution for like summertime 3-day courses. And so, and it's so fun too, because we can use video and audio, and that's a wonderful thing as well, because as you know well, far more people can listen and watch than can read. Now you have to read to partake in our courses as well, but it's a great opportunity. And it's so fun to have the professors come down there and be thrilled about it. We want the professors we already have to teach multiple courses because they're very good lecturers, and they've I think all, without exception, enthusiastically agreed to continue participating because we took the idiot restrictions off them. It's like, teach what you want to the people who want to listen. No holds barred. It's so fun. It's so fun.
with the state of higher education the way it is today, how does it recover, or does it just get replaced?
Well, I guess what I'm hoping at least that the Peterson Academy will do with the production quality of our courses is up the ante. It's like, even if we fail financially, because, we don't know how to price this, how the hell do you figure out something like that? We've argued about it a lot, and we don't know what the potential financial market might be. But at minimum, we'll be able to launch the courses independently if the platform itself doesn't take off. We're going to show Harvard and Stanford and Oxford and Cambridge what's possible with regards to lecturing with the new technology. I mean, they're stuck in like 1860.
Right.
And with these like online large courses that places like MIT, for example, have launched, basically all they do is put up a camera and videotape a lecture. It's like, you can't do that. That's the YouTube and the technologies that allow for the dissemination of video. They have they're their own medium, right? The medium is the message. You have to use the bloody technology. You can't stay stuck a century back, which is why we've done tight edits and filled in the backgrounds with images. And there's just no reason that can't be everywhere.
Right.
So, and why would you pay? Look, people probably pay $300,000 for an Ivy League education because that's where they meet their wife or their husband when it gets right down to it.
Is that really what it is?
Well, Joe, look, you never know what an institution is doing. Okay, so what does a university do? Lectures, accreditation. Okay, but that's not all. It gives you an identity for 4 years while you sort your life out. It gives you an opportunity to mature away from your parents. It gives you the opportunity to build a new network of peers, not only living peers, but peers in the historical tradition. And it gives you an opportunity to meet the person that you might be with for the rest of your life. That's a big deal. And it's a selective opportunity because you bring bright kids together who are hardworking and they get a chance to meet each other. That might be the whole value of an Ivy League education. It's hard to specify these things. Now, we're trying to replicate that on Peterson Academy with the social media side. And, that's a new technology. We don't know how it'll work. But the fact that it's selective and it won't be full of trolls and bots and bad corporate actors should mean that people will be able to build social networks that are of high value. Because that's one of the things, obviously, that's what you do in a bloody MBA program. It's not what you learn at an MBA program that confers the value of the degree. It's the fact that it was bloody difficult to get in because the GMAT is an IQ test, essentially, and the social network you build in the MBA program. You carry that with you. Well, we're doing what we can to replicate that online. And we're going to make sure that we offer potential employers a record of our students' progress and success so that they have some sense that the person who they hire has done the apprenticeship work on their own necessary to accredit them as a valid student and a hard worker. And I think we can do that. And I think we can do it more effectively than universities do it. I know how to measure these things.
It's going to be very interesting if that becomes a criteria in which people are hired. If it really does become a thing and it becomes something where people are accepting that as an education and seeking people out in that regard, it's going to be very interesting to see if more of those emerge. Mm-hmm. If you start a trend and then...
Well, at minimum, we can assure a potential employer of two things. We didn't attract a woke crowd, and we didn't indoctrinate our bloody students. So that's not a bad minimum. Right. You can assure intelligence, you can assure a work ethic because they've completed the course material improperly. We can assure that's properly measured. But we can also say, here's a bunch of things they didn't learn. Right? And when the courses are subversive in the most traditional possible way. So we have Larry Arnn, for example, who's the president of Hillsdale. He did a lecture series on Churchill. And where are you going to go to university to get a lecture series on Churchill? And Arnn was Churchill's primary biographer, or one of his primary biographers. So that's a big deal. We've got Nigel Bigger from Oxbridge lecturing on the legacy of UK colonialism. Well, you're not going to get that anywhere else. And he's a great lecturer, and he's a brilliant man and very, very courageous. And Larry Arnn is in exactly the same category. So the technology we're using is revolutionary in a variety of different ways. The lectures are high quality, but the whole ethos of the educational offering is completely different than what is on offer, say at the typical Ivy League,
Right.
Harvard, for example, which is such a catastrophe. Like, I was there at Harvard in the 1990s. I loved that place. It was really forward-looking and aimed at excellence, with very minor exceptions, like truly minor exceptions. It was a powerhouse, man. And I went back and saw a bunch of my old professor friends a month ago, and they've all joined free speech movement at Harvard, and they're fighting against their own administration. And these were like the best professors I ever met in my life. And that's what they've been reduced to.
When did it start? The decay.
Specifically in the universities?
Yes.
It started with the incursion of, what would you say, a modified Marxism in the 1960s, and then really accelerated in the 70s. It sort of went like this. You know how things fail, gradually, then suddenly. And it hit critical mass in terms of failure probably around 2014, 15, pretty much when things blew up around me. That's why they blew up around me.
And what do you think ultimately caused it to not course correct? What do you think ultimately caused these universities to give in to that?
Okay, let's talk about ultimate. So let me tell you a story, an old story. So there's a myth from Mesopotamia called the Enuma Elish, which is one of the oldest stories that we have. And let me just lay out the story, because these ancient myths capture the fundamental dynamics of culture. They're winnowed to do that. Okay, so the Mesopotamians believed that the world emerged as the interaction of two forces. We already alluded to them: chaos and order. They had a god of order, Apsu. He was a male god. He's the patriarchy. You can think of Apsu as the patriarchy. And a female god, Tiamat. Tiamat is a dragon, and a dragon of chaos. And the word Tiamat is the same word etymologically as the word tohu vabohu, and that's the chaos that God makes the world out of at the beginning of time in the Hebrew accounts. Okay, so you have Apsu and Tiamat, and they come together. Chaos and order come together, and they produce the first world. And in the Mesopotamian account of things, that's a world of higher order gods. Now, those higher order gods forget their ancestors and go about their business, and they get increasingly fractious and undisciplined and hedonistic and immature. And at one point, they kill their father, Apsu, and they try to live on his corpse. Right. So you see an echo of this. It's very complicated. You see an echo of this in the story of Pinocchio. There's a scene in Pinocchio where Geppetto ends up in the body of a whale. Okay, so here's the underlying biological dynamic. It's so remarkable. So imagine a society sets itself up according to a set of principles, and it creates a giant storehouse of wealth. Okay, that's what a carcass is, right? So if you're a primordial herder, your wealth is in the bodies of your herd animals. Okay, a body is a symbol of stored wealth. In the Mesopotamian pantheon, the careless kill their father and live on its corpse. Okay, that's what's happened to the universities. So since World War II, the West has gathered huge storehouses of value everywhere. Harvard's a great example. Immense endowment. Remarkably valuable brand. Disney's another example. And what's happened is, and this happens all the time, if you have an unguarded storehouse of value, the parasites come marching in. Right, and they try to live on the corpse. Now, they can for a while because it's a storehouse of value, but they kill the spirit. Now, what happens in the Mesopotamian story is that chaos itself comes flooding back in the form of Tiamat, who's extremely, the goddess of chaos, who's extremely angry that her husband has been sacrificed by the careless denizens of the world. That's the death of God. So, yeah, and the savior emerges in the Mesopotamian story. It's so interesting. So the savior that emerges to set things right has eyes all the way around his head. So he pays attention and he speaks magic words. That's Marduk. And so the Mesopotamian empire was an avatar of Marduk, and he's the spirit of responsibility that sets the world right. Okay, so what are we seeing? We're seeing the invasion of storehouses of wealth by the parasites, fundamentally. Has that killed them? I can't think through how you would rescue an institution, a typical upper level university institution. What are you going to do? How are you going to do that? You're going to fire 80% of the people? Who's going to do that?
Right.
No one's going to do that. Now, you could say, well, we'll make DEI initiatives forbidden. They're kind of doing that in Florida. But all you do is change the words. I mean, that's what the postmodernists did with Marxism in the 1970s when it no longer was fashionable to worship Stalin, after everybody realized that he was a psychopathic murderer. All that happened was the French intellectuals changed the terminology and they invented a form of Marxism that was even worse than Marxism, which was really quite the bloody achievement. Do I think they can be rejuvenated? I can't see how.
Well, when you have people like the president of Harvard that gets fired for plagiarism but maintains the exact same salary in a different job.
Yeah, as if demotion to a full Harvard professor was, well, you know, she's not suitable to be president, but she can still be a fully tenured professor at Harvard. It's really, she can, eh? With that publication record. I just interviewed Carol Swain. Do you know who Carol Swain is?
No.
Black law professor from whom Gay plagiarized much of her work. Yeah, fun. So what do you do with an institution that's that far gone? You saw what those university professors did at Congress, and they thought they were right. They didn't even look put upon. They looked put upon and shocked when they were challenged by the congressman.
They're not accustomed to being questioned, and also to communicating outside of their bubble. In their bubble, where their opinion is held in high esteem.
Yes, and everyone else is an idiot as far as they're concerned.
Well, when the woman from Penn, when she was smiling, every time she was answering these questions.
It was. I'd never seen anything like that. Like, I knew that the universities had become warped. And the warp is very deep. So I talked about the Mesopotamian story, and there's another angle of deep warping. So the spirit of Marx is a very old spirit. It was alive in the French Revolution. It was alive in the Soviet Revolution. You can trace it all the way back to the story of Cain and Abel, as far as I'm concerned. And the story of Cain and Abel is the story of the fundamental human dynamic after the fall of man. So insofar as we're historical creatures, the story of Cain and Abel lays out the essential psychological conflict that characterizes human beings. And so you have Cain on the one side. So Cain doesn't bring his best to the table. He makes second-rate offerings and lies about it. And then they're not accepted by him or his fellow man or women or by society or by God, and then makes him bitter. And instead of learning, he takes his complaints to God and he says something like, well, what the hell's going on here? I'm breaking myself in half, making my sacrificial offerings, and everything's being rejected. What kind of stupid cosmos did you produce? And God says to him something very interesting and complicated. He says something like, you're blaming your bitterness on your failure, and you have failed, and you know it, and you didn't have to, but it isn't your failure that's making you bitter. You've invited something in to inhabit you that's turned you against yourself and what's good. He says to him, sin crouches at your door like a sexually aroused predatory animal, and you invited it in to have its way with you. And there's a sexual metaphor there. Oh yeah.
That's heavy.
It's rough, man. It's rough. You don't get to be a high school shooter till you've had 1,000 hours of brooding over your misery. And so that's what God tells Cain. And that makes him violently angry and murderous. And so he kills Abel. He kills his own ideal. And Abel, you have Cain, who makes poor sacrifices and whines about it. He's the perennial victim, shaking his fist at God and the world, refusing to learn from his experiences. And you have Abel, who makes the right sacrifices and aims upward. That's the pattern. Two spirits. That's the Joker and Batman. That's Lex Luthor and Superman. That's Voldemort and Harry Potter. It's Satan and Christ. Like it's this eternal recurrent pattern. And one of its manifestations is Marxism, and another one of its manifestations is postmodernism. And so this is a very old story. It's a very old story. And you can understand Cain's point, because people do break themselves in half in life trying to struggle forward, and they're not successes in their own eyes, and they're rejected by other people, and it undermines their faith in being itself. You can understand that, but you're called upon to bring your best to the table no matter what happens to you, and to maintain your faith and your courage, and to aim up. There's no excuses. Your past trauma, there's no excuses. Doesn't matter what it is. And so there's this battle. And what's happened in the universities is the universities have been captured by the resentful spirit of Cain. And so that's all flowered up with postmodern language. There's no ultimate unity. That's the claim of the postmodernists. There's no overarching narrative. It's like, that's what the postmodernists claim, skepticism with regards to meta-narratives. It's like, well, what do you mean by that? You mean that everything culminates in disunity? That's your theory of being? So how the hell do we come together as a society then? And around what? Well, everyone goes their own way. Yeah, that's called war. So is there a higher unity in which everything participates or not? Well, the postmodernists is like, no, have it your way. Nihilism, disunity, anxiety, hopelessness, social disintegration, conflict. That's that pathway. And that's just where it starts. That's the optimistic view. So we're trying to present at Peterson Academy and the other enterprises that I'm engaged in, we're trying to present a unified underlying vision and a traditional unifying underlying vision. And I think that it's understandable, what we talked about in the first part of this interview. Like, once you understand that sacrifice is the basis of community, and once you understand that there's a ultimate form of sacrifice, and that's what's demanded of you if you're going to strive upward, then the contours of the religious story that undergirds the West fall into place. And that's a very remarkable thing to observe. And I think that's going to happen. I think we're at the end of the Enlightenment, and something new is striving mightily to emerge.
Well, it's also interesting that these higher education institutes, even though they do have, the way you're describing, they're extremely wealthy. They're extremely valuable. The name brand to them is still extremely potent. They have so many things going against them in terms of like an objective analysis of what's good for your education and what's good for preparing for your future. And then on top of that, they're burdened with this insane financial problem. The insane problem of, first of all, student loans being something you never get out of.
Indentured servitude.
Yeah. And the fact that we all know that the human frontal lobe, especially on males, doesn't even fully develop until you're 25. So you're kind of taking advantage of a developing mind and locking them into an insane burden of debt.
And ideology.
And so you're strapped with debt, so you must work. And then you must work within these structures that have been infected by this ideology, because everyone's coming out of the universities into those places, into those businesses and corporations, and they're deeper and deeper interwoven into the structure of these businesses to the point where they're inescapable. And then you can't leave because you have financial burdens. You have all the student loan debt to pay off.
Right.
Something as an alternative to that, if it can become effective to the term, like if people can get employment. It's interesting,
well, as soon as we determine the accreditation route, like I said, I'm in active communication with a number of people who are interested in accreditation, but I have to figure out if that's the right route. If it isn't, I'm going to work directly with interested employers to make sure that what our students obtain as a consequence of going through the Peterson Academy process is recognized by them as a marker of a high quality applicant.
Yes.
And I know that problem is solvable because I know how to do that.
Well, there's a lot of employers now that are kind of discounting the ideas of degrees. And Elon is a big one of them.
Yeah. Yeah,
There's
absolutely.
there's quite a few people that you shouldn't dismiss someone as being qualified for a certain position just because they've gone through some very formal process.
Not if the formal process isn't predicated on general cognitive ability and conscientiousness.
Right. If it's predicated on bullshit and grift, which a lot of it is.
Yeah.
What do you think is going to happen with society in general with the implementation of AI and the inevitable erosion of jobs?
I don't know if the erosion of jobs is inevitable.
No.
Well, we've thought that before. Well, first of all, the first thing I would say is like all bets are off. Right. All bets are off.
Right.
We're going to have hyper intelligent AI within 5 years. In fact, we already have it. Well, I'm being pessimistic.
Right.
I've used ChatGPT and Grok and some systems that my colleagues have developed. We built our own large language models in-house. So I built my colleague, Victor Swift, built a large language model for me, trained on my books. And I used it to help me write this next book because I could come across biblical passages that I couldn't understand, and I could ask this AI system for a first pass interpretation, and it could do a good job. Wow. And we're going to release that along with the book. Yeah, so that was really something. And I'll tell you, ChatGPT and Grok were unbelievably useful as research assistants. So they're about as smart as high-end undergraduates. They lie a lot. You have to corner them like mad to get them to provide you with information that's valid.
What have you found them lying about?
Oh, they make up references that don't exist. So, for example, for ChatGPT, about a quarter of the academic references it produces for you don't exist.
What?
Yeah. Well, it doesn't know. Like it will produce a reference for you that's completely plausible, except that it doesn't exist. So, if I ask ChatGPT a question, it'll answer and it'll give me the references because I asked for the references. Then I have to go and look up all the references and read them, first of all, because you're supposed to read the things you refer to. But also, I have to make sure that it's not, wandered off into some hallucinatory pathway. But that'll be taken care of in no time flat, as far as I'm concerned. And Musk has already got plans to do that. So what will the addition of these AI systems mean to us? God. Well, I talked to Elon about this when we had our interview, and it's going to depend to some degree, Joe, on how we train the damn things. So there's this problem called the alignment problem. That's how the engineers describe it, which is how do we know that these AI systems will have human interest in mind? And you think, okay, how do we make machines that have human interests in mind? And then you think, oh, well, we have the same problem with adolescents. How do we ensure that we train our children so that they have their own interests and broad social interests in mind? And the answer always has been that you provide them with a classic religious and humanities education, because that provides an axis of stability around which all other knowledge can be organized. Now, the problem with large language models at the moment is they're hyper-trained on modern text, and so they're ideologically addled and woke. And so we've been experimenting with training LLMs on a more classic basis. So we trained one on the King James Bible, and we haven't released it because I don't know what to think about it. It's like you can ask the King James Bible a question. Like, what the hell does that mean?
Right.
Well, like, seriously, what does that mean? And before we release it, we also want to make sure that we have it. We've developed the underlying technology properly. Okay, so what's the answer to your question? What AI will do will depend on the intent of the people who design it. Here's a terrifying thing. You tell me what you think about this.
Okay.
All right, so your thoughts are orienting phenomena. So you think so that you can lay out a pathway to a desired destination. And then you can evaluate the thought to see if that's a good strategy to get there. Okay, so there's an implication that comes along with that. A thought enters the theater of your imagination in relationship to your goal. So you can formulate that in religious language. The spirit that answers your prayers, the nature of the spirit that answers your prayers will be dependent on the nature of your prayer. Yeah, that's for sure. Right. Yeah. So imagine that you're harboring feelings of resentment and bitterness as you're plotting your economic pathway forward. And so you're trying to think about what you should do, but you have the spirit of resentment and bitterness sitting on your shoulder. The thoughts that enter your mind are going to be a consequence of your possession by that bitterness to the degree that you've allowed it to shape your goal. So here's a corollary of that. This is stunning. It's a stunning thing to understand. If you orient your aim upward in the highest manner, the spirit that informs your thought will be the spirit of the highest possible aim. And God, that's something to know, man. So that's what a religious practice, a fundamental religious practice is for. It's like, get rid of the corrupt motivation. Get rid of it. Get rid of it. Pray for the salvation of your soul, that you're aiming right, because your aim is going to determine the content of your thoughts. And that is how it works technically. That's how it works neuropsychologically. Your thoughts are the handmaiden of your aim.
Right, which is why we're always worried about sociopaths, because they never abandoned that corrupt motivation.
Yeah, well, they're basically, the best way to think about the narcissists and the hedonists and the histrionic types and the borderlines and the antisocial personalities is that they never matured cortically. So like children come into the world in a way as a bundle of competing subcortical motivations, right? And they're very powerful motivations. Anger, for example, you watch a 2-year-old have a temper tantrum, it's quite the show. And they want short-term immediate gratification. Now what happens as your cortex matures, you transcend those lower order instinctual motivations, that would be the Freudian id, and you start to regulate your behavior in relationship to your own future. So you stop doing stupid, pleasurable things in the moment that will compromise you, and you start to be able to incorporate the views of other people. That's how kids at 3 start to develop the ability to have friends. And the more sophisticated you get, the more other people and their perspectives are part of your perceptions, and the more the future is taken into account in your actions. And the cortex is actually there so that that can happen. And it has to happen in a social context, because you have to pick up the society of your peers, obviously. And so conditions like psychopathy, or even power seeking for that matter, are conditions of radical immaturity. And so that's how you explain their emergence. And one of the things that's interesting about that is it provides a very powerful argument against moral relativism. It's like there's a real difference between maturation and immaturity. Maturation is productive and sustainable, and immaturity is divisive and destructive. And there's no ifs, ands, or buts about that.
Right.
And so, see, it's a different view of mental health, because the classic therapist-produced view of mental health is that mental health is sort of inside you. You know, it's in your psyche, it's in your mind, but it's not. Like, your mental health is the harmony of your existence in relationship to the future and other people, right? And that sense of well-being that can infuse you if you get the balance right isn't a reflection of the proper structuring of your function of your mind or your brain. It's a phenomenon that emerges when everything is in its proper place and operating harmoniously. That's what you experience in music. Like, music represents that. Everything in its proper place. That's what Adam is called upon by God to do in the story of Adam and Eve. To subdue the world. Subdue everything in its proper place so that the whole structure operates in a harmonious manner. It's a much more expanded view of what constitutes mental health. Anyways, education should serve that, right? And so if you take the staff of Moses, it's planted in a single place. The community grows around that. That's the same as the magic wand of Gandalf, that idea of a magic wand. It's the traditional ethos associated with transformation and sacrifice around which communities aggregate themselves. And a proper humanities and religious education inculcates that center structure so that knowledge can be organized around it. The last time we talked, I suggested to you that we see the world through a biblical lens. Literally see it. I mean, literally structures our perceptions. And I've investigated that far more deeply. And what seems to be the case with a corpus of stories like the biblical library, is that if you know the stories, it structures your psyche so that you have a place to put information. And so that enables you to understand the current world and everything that's happening, but to place everything in the right context. And so the transmission of an unbroken cultural edifice, story-based edifice, is the manner in which you solve the alignment problem, unite your society, integrate your psyche, pursue what's meaningful, and protect yourself from chaos and anxiety. So, and a solid education has been the traditional way of ensuring that that occurs. And so, well, that's what we hope we can offer with Peterson Academy. That's the purpose of my books as well, to elucidate that. And so, can the universities do that? I don't think so.
I don't know if they have that philosophy. The philosophy and the way you're laying it out resonates with me. I think it's accurate. I think it when I'm in harmony in my life, it all seems to make sense. It all works together. Mm-hmm. What you're saying, it just rings true. I don't know if they're so infected with this ideology that flies in the face.
They've rejected it wholeheartedly.
Yes.
Look, the premise of the postmodernists is that there's no uniting meta-narrative. If you had to define postmodernism in one phrase, that would be it. And so what have they done? Here's the association with Marxism. Okay, so the Marxists have a counter-narrative. It's the narrative of power. And it is a very powerful counter-narrative, because if you don't put the proper uniting principle at the pinnacle, mm-hmm. its power emerges immediately, because people play power games, and right. You can attain a certain degree of success and a fair amount of domination by playing a power game. And so Marx observed that one of the cardinal power games is economic, and it is probably the cardinal power game, right? There's economic disparity. Those at the top do take advantage of their position at the top to stabilize their position. Like in a functional society, productive people are at the top, but even among those at the top, they're still power-seeking crooks. Mm-hmm. And so now Marx, of course, would say that, well, everyone who's economically successful is a power-seeking crook. And, that's a great thing to believe if you're a resentful Satanist like Marx.
Well, it's how the losers look at the world.
Well, that's for sure. But there is some justification in it, because among the successful, there are...
Yes.
Right, okay.
And a large percentage, because that's the culture in which they're existing.
Yeah, well, a dangerous percentage.
Yes.
And a critique of power is always a valid critique. Okay, so what the postmodernists did when Marxism became ethically unacceptable, and that happened in the 1970s, is they metastasized it. They said, okay, we've got a victim-victimizer narrative that's played out in the economic sphere. That's basically Marxism. We'll just multiply that until the same interpretive framework can be applied to all possible group distinctions. That's basically intersectionality. So sex is a oppressor versus oppressed narrative. Gender is an oppressed versus oppressor narrative. Ethnicity, race, ability, attractiveness, height. Any qualitative distinction is now recast as a battle between oppressor and oppressed. It's an unbelievably brutal story. It's basically equivalent to the claim that the spirit of power is the ruler of the cosmos.
How can they do all this and ignore the possibility of an oppressor, like a male, adopting the identity of the oppressed of a female and entering into femile spaces
you can see
oppressing females?
You can see that it can't be dealt with, because
wild, right? That is wild.
Look, one of the things you see that's very characteristic of the utopian left is the absolute insistence that anyone oppressed is a victim. It's like, okay, we'll give the devil his due. Some oppressed people are victims, but some people who claim to be oppressed aren't victims. They're the worst kind of monsters that the most deranged imagination could barely conceptualize. Utopian, naive, radical progressives refuse their imagination for evil, and that delivers them into the hands of the absolute bloody psychopaths.
Right.
And they just don't see it. It's like, oh, those trans people, they're just striving to be free. It's like, you wait until you have one of them in your house, buddy, and you're going to find out just exactly how naive you are. So how do they protect themselves? They just deny the existence of malevolence or attribute it to socioeconomic inequality.
Right.
All criminals are victims.
Right.
It's like, no, first of all, lots of people who are victims aren't criminals. In fact, poverty does not cause criminality. That's a lie. And it's a very damaging lie to the poor. Because if poverty was equivalent to criminality, the logical thing to do is just to lock up all the poor.
Right.
Right. Well, there are many pathways from poverty forward, and one of them is criminality, but you can say the same thing about wealth. So the idea, and that's basically a Marxist theory of causality, is like, well, those people's oppression is what's causing their lack of law-abiding what conduct. It's like, no, wrong, seriously wrong, and dangerously wrong, and ridiculously naive. That's not how the world works at all.
Right. You're also, in a sense, you're encouraging this kind of behavior because you're not punishing people for it, because you're saying it's not their fault.
Or you're even valorizing it. Oh, you poor thing.
Right. And you're allowing more of it to take place.
Well, we know that. So the dark tetrad types, so those are the subclinical psychopaths. Okay, so they're psychopathic. That makes them predatory and parasitic. That's the definition of a psychopath. Okay, they're narcissistic. So what does that mean? They want unearned social status, right? They're Machiavellian. So what does that mean? It means that their use of language is subordinated to their demand for hedonistic gratification and power. So like you and I, in principle, we hope, we're trying to pursue a thread of conversation that leads to further development, let's say, for us and for the audience. But I could easily be in here thinking, okay, what the hell do I have to tell Joe to increase my social media status? Right. And to play this situation as a game to enhance my own status or to further my selfish desires. That's Machiavellian. That was the dark triad. And what further investigation revealed that you had to add an additional dimension to that to fully flesh out the picture. Sadism. What's that? Positive delight in the unnecessary misery of others. That's the dark tetrad types. Well, dark tetrad types portray themselves as victims, right? That's one of their Machiavellian strategies. So now your question is, well, how do we segregate the real victims, so to speak, from the false victims? And one of the answers to that is like, beware of those who claim victimization as a justification for their moral, what would you say? For their moral transgressions. I did this because I'm a victim. It's like, really?
Right.
Really? That was your reason? Poor you. That's your story, you monster. There are no monsters. It's like, if you think there are no monsters, you're naive and willfully blind to the point of delusion and, what would you call it? What do they say? There are none so blind as those who will not see. That certainly applies on the malevolent side.
And then from the point of view, if you're looking at the people that are committing crimes, there's the unfortunate reality that people mimic their environment. And if you grow up in an environment where there are no positive role models and you see nothing but rampant crime around you, even good people go down bad paths.
Okay, so antisocial personality is somewhat heritable. There is some familial transmission. There is a role played by fatherlessness in particular. And that's perhaps because fatherless boys tend to turn towards a gang orientation, and the gangs of adolescence have a short-term time horizon. So they future discount badly, and that produces a proclivity for short-term gratification, and that includes like idiot criminal behavior.
Right.
Yeah. So what you need in a father, you need someone who encourages intelligent, upward-aiming sacrifice and an orientation towards others and future development. Like that's what the spirit of the father really does, is that encouragement. So, and that reward for delay of gratification. So that's another indication of the relationship between, say, upward striving, moral orientation and maturity. If you're mature, you can delay gratification. Now, what does that mean? It means you've integrated the future into your perceptions, right? And that has to be socially scaffolded, especially for men. Women, they get initiated by nature. In every society that we know of, men have to be initiated, right? Right, because that catalyzation of maturity is a difficult thing. Difficult and unlikely, but possible and necessary.
So how do you reach the people that are young adolescents that are trapped in that vicious cycle?
Yeah, well, I think I can tell you the answer to that. You know, a lot of young men have been watching and listening to the sorts of things that I've been writing about and producing. And every time someone comes up to me and tells me that reading, say, 12 Rules for Life had helped them, I ask why. It's like, okay, good. What changed? And the overwhelming pattern of response is something like, I started to understand the necessity of responsibility. Now, you might then ask, well, you hear from your parents, in principle, you hear from the school system, although that's probably gone, that, you know, you should grow up and be responsible. Why did it make a difference? Why did it make a difference to you to read that in what I wrote? And the answer is, I didn't take the standard conservative approach. I didn't say, you should, you must, you ought, even though those things are true. I said, there's no difference between responsibility and adventure. That's a killer thing to know. The heavier the responsibility, the more profound the adventure. And so everyone knows that, but it's not catalyzed, eh?
Right.
So I just watched The Hobbit a while back, classic adventure story. And of course, it's Bilbo, to begin with, it's Bilbo. He's this little hobbit, right? Son like Abraham, he's living his comfortable life, and the wizard comes along and says, it's time for you to develop your shadow side, because, of course, he becomes a thief, and to go on your adventure. And he agrees to do that, and it's a weighty adventure. He has to contend with the ring of power. Right, that's the ultimate in temptations. That's the temptation that Christ is offered by Satan in the desert, the temptation of power. And that's the temptation that Bilbo has to contend with. Well, he has this adventure. Well, what's the adventure? It's responsibility. He has to carry that ring. And it is one of the rings that unites everything, power. It's just the malevolent ring that unites everything. And so I've been suggesting to young men in particular, it's like, you want to get your life together? Take the path of maximal responsibility. Not because you should, even though you should. That's not why. It's because that's the pathway of maximal adventure. So you say, well, what's the meaning of life? It's like, it's the meaning that reveals itself when you take the pathway of maximal responsibility. That's exactly the message of the crucifixion. That's precisely the message. Pathway of maximal responsibility. And that's a terrifying thing. There's no difference between that and the dragon and treasure stories that are, you know, unbelievably archaic. The greatest possible treasure is to be found where the danger is most intense.
Right.
Yeah. Always.
Right. The dragon guards the gold.
Always.
Right.
Well, and so one thing to know is that if there's a dragon, there's a treasure somewhere. Really?
Right.
Really?
Right.
You know, my family and I have really learned this in the last 6 years, because we were subject to continued and what assaults in the public sphere that were designed to be deadly. And
what do you mean by that? Designed to be deadly.
Oh, interviews with journalists in particular, snake journalists whose every single utterance is designed to entrap the person being interviewed into saying something that will devastate their reputation personally to enhance the status of the interviewer.
Like the Kathy Newman conversation.
Well, Kathy at least had a bit of a sense of humor, but Helen,
the intent.
Oh, yeah, the intent. That's the serpent.
Yeah.
Man. That's the intent. It's like, well, Nellie Bowles, who interviewed me for the New York Times, now part of the Free Press, she admitted that. She said that her job at the New York Times, like the job of many of the reporters, was to find someone, demolish their reputation by any means necessary, and elevate their status in consequence.
Wow.
Yeah.
What a terrible job.
Brutal.
So isn't it terrifying that that's the old gray lady. That's the most trusted and respected source of news, and that their intent was just to destroy.
Yeah,
it wasn't the news. It wasn't real journalism. The nuanced various elements of what a human being is, the pros and cons, the goods, the bads, the ugly, the battle that they have. Not that. No. Not an accurate assessment, not an objective analysis of the person. Just
pursuit of status.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, that's
the
part
danger is that people know that now, and people know who's doing that now, and then they go after them. And you see that now.
Yeah.
And journalists say, "Oh, it's attack on journalism."
Yeah,
like,
right.
no, you're not doing journalism. You're doing hit pieces, and you're doing it under the guise of journalism. But it's not journalism. It's kind of evil.
Yeah.
It's kind of fucked up.
Yeah, kind of.
I've seen quite a bit of it where I'm like, especially with people that I know the actual story and what was really going on behind the scenes. It's like, this is maddening.
Mm-hmm.
This is wild.
Well, we started to learn after this had happened 2 or 3 times, like there's a kind of a process, because you're exposed to that. And then there's an intermediary period where it looks like it might succeed.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very stressful.
Right.
That's usually when people come out with their apologies.
Right.
Because they're just terrified. They're going to lose. Well, I did lose my job and I lost my clinical practice.
Right.
Right. So like the costs are real.
So your situation in Canada was that they wanted you to sign up for re-education.
Oh no, that's already that's the plan.
Right.
I couldn't sign up. They said already that I have to do that.
Right.
But we have an appeal in at the moment that's blocking it.
And this is all just what it affects is what in Canada? What is it?
I wouldn't. If I don't undergo the re-education process successfully, they'll suspend my license and also say why. They'll say, well, Dr. Peterson is uneducable. He's unprofessional. He's violated the ethical tenets of his profession.
Right, just because you have a different perspective on things than they do.
No, it's because I'm actually telling the truth that clinicians bloody well know and are too cowardly to admit. So, they went after me for 4 reasons, probably. One of them was the entire transcript of the last conversation I had with you.
Whoops.
Right, that was submitted as a complaint because I was talking about the climate lies. They went after me because of the comments I've made about the trans butchers and liars, the surgeons and the therapists who are enabling them. That's a major part of it. They went after me because I went after Trudeau and his former chief of staff. And what else? Those are the major 3. There's probably 4 complaints aligned with each of those dimensions. And so that's cost me about $1 million in legal fees so far. So it's a very hard battle to fight. It's very annoying because the accusations continue to flow in, even though that's a choice of the college. And I've already been sentenced to re-education of indefinite duration, right, till they're satisfied that I've learned whatever the hell lesson I'm supposed to learn. So that the only reason that isn't happening is because we now have an appeal in front of the Supreme Court in Canada. And so I don't think it'll succeed, but we'll see.
Is it important to you to maintain your license, or is it important to you to win this?
It's important. There's 2 things that are important to me, likely. One is I'm not going to let a pack of ideologically addled moralists, lying moralists who are facilitating the butchery and sterilization of children take away my license, not without a war. So that's one thing. The second thing is I'm in a prime position in Canada to undertake this battle against the woke licensing boards because I have the money, and what the hell are they going to do to me? I'm not practicing.
Right.
They can't take away my income, and likely they can't blacken my reputation except among those who are willing to assume that the licensing colleges are playing a straight game. So really, there's nothing they can do to me. Plus, if it was only a personal thing, apart from the fact that I'm not letting my license be taken by a pack of intellectually addled hypocrites, there's a part of me that's deeply ashamed to be a psychologist at the moment. I'm so appalled by my compatriots. They know that this gender dysphoria pathology is a lie. They all know it. And they won't say anything. Now, partly they won't say anything because the consequences for saying something are not trivial. But the consequences for not saying anything is that people like Chloe Cole end up with their breasts cut off when they're 15. Right. Well, that actually matters. Right. So practically speaking, in a sense, the battle doesn't mean anything to me because I'm fighting to remain a member of a club that I don't really want to be part of. But is there a principle at stake? Well, there's a variety of principles at stake. And so if I stop or lose all of the woke licensing enterprises, they'll just have their sway. All the physicians in Canada are terrified to say what they think. Anybody who's governed by a professional college, they censor themselves like mad. And it's really appalling for psychologists because all of the psychologists who are properly trained, they know that all of this is a lie, and not just a lie, a malevolent, vicious, and destructive lie. Everything about it's a lie. You know, Musk revealed the other day that the professionals that were interacting with him in regard to his transitioning son told him that if he didn't abide by their dictates, that his son was much more likely to commit suicide. That's a lie. No one who's educated as a psychologist believes that to be true. No one. At minimum, if you're educated, what you understand is that underneath gender dysphoria is something more substantial, which is a proclivity towards depression and anxiety. If you're depressed and anxious, you have a higher risk of suicide. You have to account for that before you attribute any of the remainder to gender dysphoria as such. And everyone who's a psychologist also understands that body-focused discomfort for women at puberty is normative. Because when women who have a higher probability of being depressed and anxious do become depressed and anxious, it preferentially takes the form of bodily discomfort. That's been known forever. So Chloe Cole, for example, no one explained that to her. No one sat her down and said, well, you're not very... She told me that the reason she decided to transition was because she kind of had a crush on Kardashian and that body type, you know, hyper curvy, hyper feminine. And Chloe realized when she entered puberty that she was probably going to have a boyish figure. And Chloe's a very attractive person. She would have had no trouble attracting the attention of men. But, you know, she was 11, 12. What the hell does she know? And she wasn't going to be the woman she had envisioned. She didn't really understand that, you know, there's a variety of female forms that men find attractive. That's for sure. And she certainly would have fallen into that category. She didn't know that it was typical for girls to undergo a fair bit of confusion when they hit puberty, and that would take the form of negative emotion. No one told her that. They just rushed her down the puberty blocking and surgical pathway. That's inexcusable.
It's evil.
Yeah, it is. It's the worst thing. It's the worst thing I've seen professionals do, not only in my lifetime. I've studied atrocity for 40 years. I've never seen anything worse than what's happening right now. And that includes the sorts of things that were done in the camps in Germany. At least the goddamn Nazis admitted what they did was wrong. They tried to hide it. We trumpet it as a moral virtue. We're freeing the children. It's like, no, I don't think so, mothers. I think what you're doing is sacrificing your child to the parading of your moral virtue. Oh, my son, he's so confused. He thinks I was a girl, but I still love him. That's how wonderful I am. Jesus Christ, Joe. You have no idea how dark that is.
It's dark.
It's unbelievably dark.
It's attached to an industry now.
Yeah, that's
which is
for
very
sure.
Scary. There was
an industry and an ideology.
There was an article that was recently released where this person admitted that they said it was, what was the exact phrase? That the way they described gender transition as a life-saving medical care in order to get insurance for it.
Yeah.
Because otherwise insurance won't pay for it. So they were willing to describe it in that way to ensure that people would profit off of it, which is wild.
It's
terrifying. And it's so strange because I never would have believed that this could happen. If you had asked me 20 years ago if this was going to be a main concern, that people were worried about their children being roped into this ideology and convinced that they're
and then sterilized and mutilated.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
I know.
Terrifying.
Well, it's no wonder people see. Even Michael Schellenberger, who broke the WPATH files, when we talked about the role the WPATH played in establishing their own ideology-addled butchery as the standard of care for the American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Psychological Association, Schellenberger said that after he had listened to Abigail Schreier and I talk about this trans mutilation, he was so appalled that he literally couldn't believe it. He just shelved it, said, there's no way this can be true. And I can understand that, because the more you look into it, the worse it gets.
Right.
It's unbelievably bad. These surgical procedures are so brutal and so experimental that they're I'm going to say it again, they're worse than what the Mengele types did in the concentration camps in the 30s and 40s. And that's a pretty goddamn low bar. And it's no wonder people don't want to believe it. And people say, the lefties I've talked to, the centrists, well, it doesn't happen very often. It's like, oh yeah, how often is too often? Like once is too often. And it's not once. That's for sure.
No, it's happening.
Policy.
Yeah.
In fact, you're punished by your governing boards if you don't go along with it.
And what about the recent law that they passed in California where the schools don't have to tell the parents that the child has transitioned at school? They hide that information from the parents.
Well, they're just letting those children be free, those ignored children who are looking desperately for a pathway to, what would you call it, inclusion and celebration. Oh, you're so brave.
And then they're encouraged.
That's for sure.
They're given positive feedback.
Yes,
which
definitely.
Is a real thing.
Especially if they're alienated kids to begin with, and who are unsettled in their identity.
Yeah.
Right. And aren't being guarded by anyone and are vulnerable.
Right.
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 And,
yeah.
And the parents are indoctrinated into this
or
terrified as well. Or terrified.
Right.
Yeah.
Indoctrinated, or the Munchausen by proxy types who get off on the fact that they have a child that's such a burden, but are still really, what would you say, bearing up nobly under the weight.
And that is a very dark inclination that is well documented.
Yeah, well, that's the devouring mother.
Yes.
That was what Freud warned about back in like 1880. Yeah, she's a little too close. You remember the witch in the Hansel and Gretel story?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Gingerbread house. That's a little bit too good to be true when you're lost. What's inside it? The witch that wants to fatten you up for her own delectation. That's the devouring mother. That's the maternal instinct gone mad, right? Everything good has the potential for pathology in proportion to its goodness. So Lucifer is the intellect gone mad, right? The devouring mother is the mother who's a little too close to her kids, right? Yeah, a little too close. Jesus, brutal, Joe.
It's just brutal. So stunning how widespread it is. At least UK is pulling back from this stuff, but they have socialized medicine. So they actually have to go on data. And
Canada hasn't pulled back.
Which is wild.
Yeah, and
but I think
entirely
that's true,
predictable.
Though. Yeah.
Most of the European countries have woken up, but I don't think it's going to slow it much because there's a huge underground market in puberty blockers. I've talked to experts who figure that the ratio of people on black market puberty blockers to medically prescribed puberty blockers is at least 10 to 1.
Oh, God. So they're just self-administering this stuff?
Yeah, right.
Oh, God. And it's essentially chemical castration drugs that they used to use on pedophiles.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
Yeah, that's for sure.
That's what it is. And when you tell people that and they deny it because they don't know and then they find out, it is so stunning.
They also don't want to know.
Right.
And no wonder. Yeah. Anyways, that's why we're trying to educate people.
Well, Jordan, I'm very happy you're doing this. I really am. It looks amazing. I think it's fantastic. I'm going to try some of them. I'll try some of your courses. It looks exciting.